presentation. I have been interested in Antarctica for some time. When I first got involved in the whole secret space program, extraterrestrial cover-up issue back in 2001, I was very intrigued by the evidence that something was going on in Antarctica. And one of the things I encountered as a researcher, I had been a professor at American University in Washington, DC, was just how difficult it was to find out the truth of what was going on in Antarctica, and just kind of like sorting out the incredible number of rumors and what could have been real events that were going on down there. It was pretty challenging. So really I began doing that way back in 2001, 2002. And so this has been something that has taken quite a lot of years to really wrap my mind around it. There have been a lot of people that have talked about Antarctica, and essentially, you know, the way the whole German space program fits into this is that, you know, really they've been kind of like three different approaches to Antarctica, and the German presence there. You know, the first kind of like story goes that during the Second World War, Germany developed all of these flying saucers, advanced aerospace vehicles, and that at the end of the war, a lot of that was repatriated under Operation Paperclip to the United States, to Russia, to Britain, and all secretly developed, and that the Germans really didn't go much beyond just developing some of these craft in Europe. And that as far as Antarctica goes, well, you know, that was not something that actually became operational. The second perspective is that the Germans were able to escape Europe at the end of the Second World War, take a lot of their stuff with them. They went down to South America. They were able to establish some projects down there, helping the Argentinian government, the administration of Juan Perón, in developing some of these advanced technology programs. And sure, there was German submarines, and that they were kind of like in the seas around Antarctica, but nothing really substantial happening in Antarctica. And so that brings us to the third set of literature, which is that the Germans did make it down there to Antarctica. So with that, let me start my PowerPoint presentation. Now, the big question here is, you know, did the Nazis build underground bases in Antarctica? Now, today we know that there are many different bases in Antarctica. I think the Antarctic Treaty, you've got, I think, 45 nations, somewhere around that have signed on. Many of them have bases in Antarctica. Like the United States officially has 3 bases in Antarctica, McMurdo, Palmer Island, and Scott Amundsen Base, which is in the, right at the geographic South Pole. But all of these bases are on the surface of Antarctica, and these bases were all created after the late 1950s. So the big question is, did the Nazis build underground bases in Antarctica in the 1940s, which is what we've been told by those that say that a German secret space program actually was established and flourished out of Antarctica in the 1940s. So that's the big question. So did they establish bases in Antarctica? Well, there are some photos of alleged Antarctic caverns down there in Antarctica, and this is one photo, and there you see what looks like a very large cavern. This was shared on the rents.com site, and I haven't been able to validate that this is actually an authentic photo, but Rents does say that based on his kind of research that this is an authentic photo from the Antarctic German expedition from 1938-39. So if that's the case, then you know, really the Germans did find entrances into these cavern systems in Antarctica. How they found those entrances? There are a number of theories about it. But the first question we have to ask is, well, is it possible? You know, is there an extensive cavern system in Antarctica? Now, for many decades, really, people have been openly skeptical of this idea that the Germans in the 1940s established underground bases in Antarctica. Said, well, where's the evidence for that? Well, you know, this photo might be evidence, but more recently we've had scientists actually confirm that they've found vast Antarctic caves deep under the ice. So here's a story from September 2018, September 2017, and it's from physics.org or phys.org, and this was something that was reproduced from in the mainstream media. So this is a group of scientists, Western scientists, that have confirmed. Down there at the bottom, the caption reads, "Steam from active volcanoes has hollowed out extensive cave systems under the Antarctic ice that could be home to unique ecosystems," scientists say. So right there, 2017, I mean, you've got some really, you know, strong hints that there is stuff happening deep under the ice in these extensive cave systems. So basically, you know, later on I'll talk about this a little more in terms of soft disclosure. But right now you've got the mainstream media disseminating stories about this extensive cavern system under the Antarctic ice. So this has been there a long, long time. It wasn't, even though it was just discovered now, these extensive cavern systems have been down there for decades. So the big question is, did the Germans discover them back in 1938-39 and then establish a presence down there? Well, there is a set of orders, which this is one of those things which is not well known, but in July 1939, Admiral Richard Byrd received orders to find the Nazi bases in Antarctica. So, and this is a story this is an excerpt from a story from the New York Times, dated July 7, and it reads, "President Roosevelt moved today to prevent possible extension of Germany's claims to Antarctic areas into the Western Hemisphere by directing Rear Admiral Richard Byrd to leave in October to territory within the sphere of influence of the Monroe Doctrine. It is apparent that this government was prepared to take the position that any attempts by foreign powers to establish bases west of the 180th meridian in the Antarctic would be considered an unfriendly act." And so then it talks about Congress funding 3 ships to go down there in the Antarctic summer of 1939. Of course, the Second World War intervened, but at that point, the United States was not at war with Nazi Germany. So what you have here is a statement from the president ordering Admiral Byrd to go down there to Antarctica to find the German bases, to make sure that they were not in the western regions of Antarctica, which would have been a violation of the Monroe Doctrine. And of course, the question that we have to ask is, well, you know, was Byrd looking for a base above ground or underground? Well, we don't know. He was just looking for a base, but he was given 3 ships, and they were basically given these orders to find the German bases down there in Antarctica. So back in 1939, the US government knew that the Germans had established bases in Antarctica, and they were looking out for them. So let's go on. So where did these Nazi bases, German bases, get established? Well, here's a map of Neuschwabenland, and that comes from the Soldaten Atlas that was used by the German military. And what I'd like to kind of like draw your attention to is this prime meridian, because this stretches up to Europe. So the German map actually showed you know, the 0 degrees going right up through Europe. And that becomes significant later when I talk about how the Germans were able to find the underground bases in Antarctica. But here you have in the red area that was claimed by Germany, which is all in the eastern portion of Antarctica. The western portion, that was what the US was concerned about, that the Germans would have established bases in the western area of Antarctica, which would have been a violation of the Monroe Doctrine. But the Germans didn't do that. The Germans established it in East Antarctica, so they weren't in violation of the Monroe Doctrine, and so they had no beef with the United States. So that was important for Hitler's regime early on. So where were these bases? If they're located underground, how could you get to them? Well, one of the things about Antarctica is that there's a vast underground network of rivers and lakes buried deep under the ice. Now, for those that live in kind of frigid areas, or areas where during the winter the water freezes over, forming these ice lakes, well, you know that water freezes from the top, not from the bottom. So you can actually have a lake or a river with the surface being frozen, and people can ice skate on it and all of that, but underneath the river can be flowing. So similarly, in Antarctica, even though you had this massive ice sheet, 2 miles thick or 3 miles thick in certain areas, still at ground level, because the ice would accumulate over time, over the millennia, and grew to be like 3 miles thick. But underneath all of that, you had this extensive network of rivers and lakes. And so when you look at this map, you can see this kind of schemata of what Antarctica looks like under the ice sheet. You can see the blue lines for the river systems that stretch all the way from the coast into these vast underground areas, below sea level. So presumably they would be lakes, or they could be caverns. Well, the blue dots are lakes. The area below the sea level, that could be a cavern system. That basically what we see here is a mechanism by which, in theory, if you knew where to go on the Antarctic coastline, you could actually find your way to one of these river systems and actually go through a submarine, or via a submarine, deep in the Antarctic interior. So this is how it could be done, according to this map. So is this how they did it? I believe that is exactly what the Germans did. The Germans, during the Second World War, were the pioneers in submarine development. The first modern submarines, which was the XX-1 or the U-21, that was the first submarine that could stay under the water for extended periods of time. Up until that time, the previous submarines could all kind of they were dual use. They were kind of ships and submarines. They could submerge for a certain time to hide from destroyers or other ships trying to find them. But at the other time, they would come to surface, and then they would launch their torpedoes or attack other craft or convoys, which was how the Germans were using their submarines for convoys attack. But during the Second World War, the Germans established the first fully submersible submarines that could stay in the water for prolonged periods. And so here you can see with this diagram shows you Queen Maud Land and the area claimed by the Germans, by the Nazis. And the one on your right shows what Antarctica looks like under the ice. And so the blue areas on this map show the river systems and the lakes underneath Antarctica. And you can see from the red arrows that I have here that a submarine could come, if it knew where to go, a submarine could come, go into the coastline, find the entranceway to one of these waterways under the, right there by the Antarctic coastline. By the coastline, the waterway presumably wouldn't be too deep, so a submarine wouldn't have to submerge too much to find one of these waterways, because the ice was accumulating on top of the continent of Antarctica. So you'd have the submarine following this passage deep into the interior, where it could establish a base, a fully fledged base. So this is a map showing a map of instructions to the German U-boat captains for how to actually find the entranceways to these underground bases in Antarctica. So at the top here, these top two maps just show longitude and latitude, where approximately the U-boats would have to kind of like try to enter into the interior from a certain place on the coastline. These are instructions. That's all in German, but I did translate, and so we'll get that in the next slide. But here it kind of gives you an outline of the geography. Here you can see, by the coastline, the Antarctic shelf goes under the water, and it shows how you go underneath the Antarctic shelf. Then you go up, and there you are. You're under the ice sheet now, but now you're kind of like at the water level, and you can sail up there indefinitely and kind of do the same thing. And so these were the instructions that the German U-boat captains had. And so this has been translated from one of these documents that was released from a U-boat, German U-boat captain. And it shows at the very top, it gives instructions, descend at the point with the coordinates, and it gives you coordinates, and it gives you these detailed instructions for how the U-boat, the submarine, could basically navigate under the ice sheet into the interior of Antarctica, and then find the underground cavern system where the Germans were building their bases. So right there, and this is a document that was leaked. I mean, as far as I've been able to determine, there's nothing that makes me believe that this is a fraudulent document, that this appears to be a genuine German Navy captain's release of this kind of detailed information for how the German U-boats could go under the Antarctic ice sheet. So quite stunning, but right there you have it. Now we kind of shift gears to, well, during all this time, we know that President Roosevelt ordered Admiral Byrd to find the bases in Antarctica, and then the war broke out. So what occurred during the Second World War was that Germany was actually building advanced spacecraft. They were pioneers in understanding anti-gravity technology. They were pioneers in understanding torsion field physics. I mean, there's been a lot of writers that have talked about this, so I don't want to kind of spend too much time on that, but it's quite clear, and it's been well documented, that the Germans were, a decade or several decades ahead of the Western powers when it came to advanced aerospace technologies. And we know, for example, that the first jet fighters were developed by Germany. The Germans developed wind tunnels for testing craft that could move at supersonic speeds. And they developed the V2 rockets and so forth. So, I mean, clearly the Germans were kind of like leaders in advanced aerospace technology. So what was the US doing at the time? Well, the US was actually embedding spies into Nazi Germany to learn all about their programs, their breakthroughs. What did the Germans know? What help were they getting in developing these advanced space technologies? So US Navy spies were sent out there, and we know this because of the testimony of William Tompkins, who was a former US Navy covert operative. He served at the Naval Air Station in San Diego from 1942 to 1946, and he says that's where the Navy spy program was based out of, and that they were basically running these spies out of Nazi Germany, flying them on a 6-month basis back to Naval Air Station San Diego, where they would be extensively debriefed, and then Tompkins would basically write up a report of the debriefings of the Navy spies, and then deliver this report to any US aerospace company, military service, think tank, university department, anywhere where people could make sense of the information that the Navy spies were bringing in about the German space program. So this was a program that was really running. One of my other books is called The US Navy's Secret Space Program, and there I go into detail into William Tompkins' testimony and what he's written. Alternatively, you can just kind of go to my website, exopolitics.org, and just type in this title, US Navy Spies Learn Secrets of Nazi Anti-Gravity Spacecraft, and you'll be given an introduction to William Tompkins' testimony. So basically, the Navy had these spies over there in Germany, and they were learning everything that they could. Now, one of the key elements of all of this is that US companies were very strongly present in Germany in the 1920s, in the 1930s, and even during the Second World War itself, which is, quite a surprise, because most people assume that, well, after the war, the US and Germany were officially at war during the Second World War, and that US companies wouldn't have continued doing trade with Germany. Well, in fact, they did. There were many companies, General Motors, the Ford Motor Company, IT&T, IBM, many US companies in the 1920s, 1930s, as well as major banks, established a foothold in Germany, and they were actually helping the rebuilding and the rearmament of Germany. There were lots of profits to be made in the rearmament of Germany, and US companies were partnering with German companies in doing this. And it's very important, because what it tells us is that there is a long history of partnership between US companies and German companies in the 1920s and the 1930s and even into the 1940s, and that this was made possible by a lot of bankers, US bankers, basically funding US corporations in building Germany's kind of new generation of war material and munitions. So this basically meant that during the Second World War, the US Navy spies had a means of infiltrating Nazi Germany. This, because of the partnerships with German companies, between German companies and US companies, it meant that these Navy spies could infiltrate US companies that were doing business in Germany and basically bring back a lot of the information. This is something William Tompkins confirmed, that this was a key part of how these US Navy spies were able to infiltrate Nazi Germany. There's a book there by Charles Higham, Trading with the Enemy, that goes into great detail into this extensive collaboration between German companies and US companies and US banks. Very extensive, all the way, and as you can see, an expose of the Nazi American money plot, 1933 to 1949. So that's telling you that this was something that occurred throughout the Second World War, up until the beginning of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. So William Tompkins says that based on what the Navy spies had told him, that the Germans had developed 30 different prototypes of anti-gravity craft. That's 30 different types of craft using different types of propulsion systems, different types of torsion field physics. The Germans were doing all sorts of innovative propulsion development for these flying saucer craft. Some of their craft used jet propulsion. So these are things that many UFO researchers have talked about based on the disclosures of people like Giuseppe Belluzzo, Rudolf Schreiber, Reinhold Meath, that all talked about their participation in the development of a German-Italian spacecraft or flying saucers, and how initially they used jet propulsion to kind of spin the craft around to reach a fast speed. So that, those were some of the unsuccessful prototypes, or at least prototypes that weren't successful in terms of being able to be mass produced for the war effort. But some of the craft were, and those were the ones that made it to Antarctica. And this is this is where we have this kind of split between many UFO researchers in terms of, well, how far did the Germans go? Some of the UFO researchers just say that, well, the physical evidence is that flying saucers were being developed in Nazi Germany, that there's irrefutable evidence, testimonial evidence as well, that these craft were tested, but Hitler was never able to successfully develop them for the war effort, that it was a failed kind of effort, and that the US was able to capture some of these and take them to the United States for development. So that's certainly true. That part of it is true. What's not, but it's incomplete, because there were successful flying saucer models that were developed. And these were the models that were taken out of Germany prior to the collapse of Nazi Germany. And these were the ones that found their way down to Antarctica, and they became the basis for the Antarctic German space program. So this is a slide. It's a poor resolution. It comes from the file of Vladimir Terzinsky, and this was released in 1991. And this shows German Space Command in Antarctica. So you can kind of see people in German uniforms in some kind of command center. This was something that came from Nazi SS files that Vladimir Terzinsky was able to get his hands on as a result of the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Because at the end of the Cold War, there were many former Warsaw Pact intelligence officers that were now suddenly looking for jobs, that the Warsaw Pact collapsed, and so they didn't have jobs or careers anymore. So they did what they knew best, which was basically use their knowledge to be able to make a living. So one of the ways that they could do this was to sell the intelligence files of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact nations to anyone that was willing to pay for it sufficiently. So this is how Terzinsky got his hands on these Nazi SS files. Terzinsky was an electrical engineer. He was a member of the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences, which is how he got his hands on these Nazi SS files, and he ended up in Los Angeles. And from 1991 to 1993, 94, I'm not exactly sure, he was doing lectures and disseminating this information to whoever would listen to it. But in 1993, 94, he disappears. Suddenly, Terzinsky's gone. No one ever hears of him again. I think what happened was that he was taken out, either physically terminated or taken to one of these underground facilities because he was spilling the beans on what was really a functioning space program out of Antarctica. And so he was kind of like, really, as far as I can tell, the first one to come out with this kind of information and back it up with evidence. And that was in 1991. He had these Nazi SS files. So he had this file here. He had this one here, which is a really interesting file. It's a Nazi SS document that lists different sorts of craft using two different types of propulsion systems. So let's look at this. This tells you the type of craft this was the Hannibal 1 craft, and he says that there are two models developed of this, and they were tested 52 times, and that they used this an E4 propulsion system, which was a just trying to think, recall the name of this propulsion system. It was something using torsion physics or torsion field principles, and it enabled the craft to travel at supersonic and even hypersonic speeds. But the Hannibal 1 was approximately 30 feet, 10 meters in diameter, and it was 2 models were made, and it was test flown 52 times. The Hannibal 2, it was 7 models were made, and it was tested 106 times. And this was the one that was intended to be a tank killer. It was the one that was supposed to be used both to shoot down US bombers, British bombers flying in, causing great damage to Nazi Germany, and also to destroy the tanks of the Allied powers. And then there was the Hannibal 3. There was 1 model made. This one was this was a much larger craft. It was roughly 100 feet. Actually, no, the Hannibal 2 was 30 meters. The Hannibal 3 was about 60 meters, so it's a huge ship. And it could fly at 40,000 kilometers per hour, which would basically meant that it was truly a spacecraft, because it could, at that speed, it could break beyond the Earth's gravity field and travel into space, into kind of, it could perform short interplanetary trips. It could fly to the moon, it could fly to Mars, and so forth. So the Hannibal 3 was the first real German spacecraft that could fly into outer space and land on the moon, go to Mars, and so forth. So this is according to these Nazi SS files that Krasinski got his hands on. So here you have another one, and it shows that this was a Hannibal 2 craft that was developed by the Dornier company, which was a major aerospace company run by Germany, that operated in Nazi Germany. And so, you know, the instructions here, the German script there has been translated, and it just basically is telling you that that this craft, that this was a Hannibal 2 craft that was tested near Vienna, and there was no need for fighter cover, that it hadn't been spotted by the Allied fleets, and so this was tested in February 1945. So, you know, obviously at this time, the Nazis were in full retreat. They had established underground bases throughout occupied Europe, and they were flying these Hannibal craft, testing them down there, trying to develop them fast enough so that they could deploy them for the war effort. And they ran out of time. They simply ran out of time. You know, this was one of the things that Hitler lived to regret, his confidence that the Germans would be successful in the war effort, because he badly calculated the strength of the Allied powers, and therefore didn't put enough emphasis into developing these advanced technologies for the war effort, because his philosophy was, well, we don't need jet craft and these kind of flying saucer craft for shooting down, you know, aircraft or destroying tanks, because that's a defensive mode. We want offensive weapons, we want bombers and so forth. So he was putting resources into that, and then realized at the very end that he needed these devices, but it was too late. So essentially what was happening in Antarctica as the war progressed, as things got worse and worse for Nazi Germany, the German secret societies established full control in Antarctica. And here you can see a map of Antarctica, the red area where they established the initial German underground bases. And here you have, this symbol is the symbol of the Black Sun, which is a German secret society that existed. Well, it's an offshoot of some earlier German secret societies, and during the Second World War, it was a very prominent part of the Nazi SS. But it was an autonomous secret society from the Nazis, from the SS itself. So the German secret societies, with the help of the German navies, were really running the show in Antarctica. And now, in the critical thing to keep in mind here is that just as the US military doesn't actually build fighter craft, aircraft carriers, rocket ships, satellites, it's companies that build these under contract for US military. Similarly, in Germany, the Nazis were not building the spacecraft that were operating out of Antarctica. It was actually being built by these companies that were fulfilling contracts for the German military. And so here you have a list of these companies like the Messerschmitt, the Focke-Wulf, and Dornier. I mentioned Dornier already for having built the Hannibal II, Volkswagen, Daimler-Benz. All of these major companies had a hand in building these flying saucer craft or building the kind of the body, the chassis for the flying saucers that were being deployed in Antarctica. So all of these companies were very prominent in doing this. You had Siemens and AEG. They were very much involved in building the propulsion systems for these craft. So some of these advanced propulsion systems using torsion field physics, using electrogravitics, Siemens and AEG were pioneers in this. So they were down there in Antarctica building these things. You had the Zeppelin company. They were building the big cigar-shaped craft that the Germans initially used for basically building interstellar spacecraft. So this was built through the Zeppelin company using these advanced torsion field physics principles, anti-gravity and so forth. You had IG Farben. They were responsible for building the weapon systems, the laser cannons that were on these spacecraft that were being built in Antarctica. Röchling, Krupp, and Rheinmetall, they were some of the major German companies that were specialists in building special alloys, special metallic alloys, so that you could develop kind of like double or even triple hulled spacecraft that could operate in deep space. So just as a submarine, most submarines have double hulls, so the German spacecraft have double or even triple hulls using special alloys. And so these are the different German companies and the way that they specialized in building the various components for the German craft down there in Antarctica. So how far did the Germans go? Well, according to Tazinski, and this has been confirmed by William Tompkins, based on the US Navy spy's testimony. Also Corey Good, who I'll talk about a little bit later on, who worked for the secret space programs for 20 years. He had access to these briefing files that he believed were derived from the Navy briefings that William Tompkins distributed to major US companies and think tanks and universities and so forth. So both of them agreed with this, and Tazinski was the third source here, saying that the Germans actually were the first to land on the moon. And as I mentioned earlier, the Hannibal III craft, the Hannibal III craft, the Hannibal III was capable of 40,000 kilometers or more, which is basically the minimum speed necessary to break Earth orbit. So on a Hannibal III craft, Werner Heisenberg and his colleagues landed on the moon and established the first presence on the moon. The first German expedition to Mars was again the Hannibal 3, departed in April of 1945, crash landed in January of 1946. So this was using the kind of propulsion system that the Germans had. They were really just pioneers at this point in developing these kinds of technologies. This was, again, Vladimir Tuzinski was saying this. So keep in mind, he was saying this back in 1991 based on these Nazi SS files that had been released. And later on, we get confirmation from Corey Good and William Tompkins based on their access to these briefings, these files that were highly classified, that they were involved in either in kind of like making in the first place, such as William Tompkins, or because of their service in these secret space programs. So that's the first German expedition to Mars, and this is for some people who may not have heard of this before. That's quite something. But based on this information, in the mid-1940s, the German space program out of Antarctica had become so successful that they were flying missions to Mars. So all of this obviously is going to need a lot of funding. How are you going to fund this? This was something that was being secretly funded by the Nazi Germany being able to repatriate or being able to kind of like channel a lot of funds out of Nazi Germany prior to the end of the Second World War, and then disseminate it to wherever it was needed for funding a Fourth Reich. And this is exactly what happened, and it's substantiated by this document. It's an U.S. Army intelligence document dated November 44, and it talked about a meeting of German industrialists in August of 1944 in Strasbourg, France, where these German industrialists were told by Martin Bormann, by the delegate for Martin Bormann, who was the Vice Führer of Germany, that the war was lost, that it was their responsibility now to take out as much capital as possible so that Germany could rebuild itself after the devastation of the end of the Second World War, and it would be rebuild itself, and it would become a major economic power using all of these stolen funds that had been that German companies had been able to get access to through Nazi Germany, and to basically expatriate these out of Germany prior to the Second World War, take them to neutral countries, take them or invest with friendly companies where they could basically build up partnerships so that after the end of the Second World War, this money would be available for the rebuilding of a Fourth Reich. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that it wasn't just a matter of a lot of these funds going to neutral countries like Switzerland, Sweden, Argentina, Spain, but also to companies that the Germans had been doing business with for decades. So these were companies in the Netherlands in particular, and especially in the United States. And so this is where you have a whole number of important figures, such as the Bush family. Prescott Bush was one of the bankers that partnered with Germany. You had the Dulles brothers, Alan Dulles and John Foster Dulles, that was also partnering with Germany, with German companies. So you had a lot of these very senior people who rose to very senior positions in the US government that were helping the Germans after the Second World War basically take all these funds out so that the Germans could then build a Fourth Reich. And the Fourth Reich, the intention was that you would have a kind of economic arm of the Fourth Reich, but that the Germany had failed twice to conquer Europe, and so the third time they would do it not through military means but through economic means. So that's very important when we keep in mind the European Union today and how it operates. Jim Mars wrote a really important book that details what was going on with the Fourth Reich, and how that was built with the aid of US companies assisting the German companies in taking a lot of capital out of Nazi Germany. 1946 to 1947, we have Operation High Jump. Now, I'm sure many of you know a lot, have heard about this, so I don't really need to spend much time here, other than just kind of like just some bullet points, some highlights. That the Operation High Jump had approximately, I think, around 4,200 personnel involved. A lot of Marines. This was a military expedition. There were 3 task forces that made up Operation High Jump. They basically went all around Antarctica, and they were obviously looking for something. Sure, the cover was that they were doing cartography and mapping Antarctica for the building of future US bases. But you don't need a military armada to do cartography. Scientists could do this quite easily, taking a few planes over there. No, this was a military task force. This was down there. It had a military mission, and that military mission was to find and take out the German bases in Antarctica. For the US Navy, what happened was that they got a big shock, because up until this time, up until 46, 47, the US military had defeated the Nazis all over the world. So they were very confident that they could defeat the Nazis in Antarctica. They didn't think that this would be a great problem, so they sent this task force down there because they thought that they would just repeat what had happened in Nazi Germany. The problem was that the Germans in Antarctica, they knew very well that the US military was eventually going to come, but they, from 1939 right up until 1947, they essentially had like over 7 years to prepare for an eventual confrontation with the US military, and they put a lot of resources into weaponizing their flying saucers, so that by the time the US Navy arrived, that they would be ready for them. And they were. They were able to weaponize their flying saucers. Their laser cannons had been successfully developed, and they shot down a lot of these craft. And so Admiral Byrd, after March 1947, actually revealed what had happened. He had to hint at it. This was at an interview he gave in March of 1947 on his way through Chile, and he said, quote, Admiral Richard Byrd, so this was Lee Van Atta, the journalist, quoting Byrd, Admiral Richard Byrd warned today of the necessity for the United States to adopt protective measures against the possibility of an invasion of the country by hostile aircraft proceeding from the polar regions. The Admiral said, I do not want to scare anybody, but the bitter reality is that in the event of a new war, the United States will be attacked by aircraft flying in from over one or both poles, end quote. So, that's really significant, because he's saying that the United States will be attacked by aircraft flying in from over one or both poles. Now, clearly, the Soviet Union could fly in over the North Pole. That was known. But both poles, the Soviet Union didn't have a presence in South America, in Antarctica. So it wasn't the Soviet Union. Byrd was very clearly indicating that the United States could be attacked by aircraft flying in from over one or both poles, and that this was a force that was present in South America, or the South Pole. And that's really powerful corroboration that we are talking about. The German program had succeeded in developing something in Antarctica that really threatened the United States, according to Byrd. So then, immediately after, so March 1947, Operation High Jump, you have the big confrontation between the Navy, the US Navy, and the German space program out of Antarctica. The Navy loses. The world isn't told. Everyone is basically told that, okay, the Operation High Jump just had a premature end, suffered some casualties, but the scientific mission was successful and so forth. But the truth was that the US had suffered a humiliating defeat from an enemy that they had defeated again and again during the Second World War. They didn't want anyone to know about this. So what happened soon after, only 3 months after Admiral Byrd gave his interview in Chile, you have the Kenneth Arnold incident, and that describes these flying wing aircraft that were very similar to the Horten flying wing craft that were being developed by Nazi Germany. Now, the thing to keep in mind here is that the Horten flying wing, that was several prototypes were made, but these were captured by the US military after the Second World War and brought back to the United States. But the key was that these were unsuccessful prototypes. The successful versions of the flying wings were taken to Antarctica, and this was what Kenneth Arnold saw in 1947. So the Germans had successfully weaponized these things, or at least successfully operationalized these things so that they could overfly US territory, and they were flying them in squadrons. That's what Kenneth Arnold says he saw. So that's very important. So you have these flying wings in a fighter squadron formation overflying US territory in 1947, June of 1947. So here you see the slide. German flying saucers disrupt V-2 rocket tests beginning in May of 1947. So again, only a couple of months after Admiral Byrd's interview, you actually have flying saucers disrupting V-2 rockets. So these are documented, that the V-2 tests were occurring out of White Sands and out of the White Sands, New Mexico, where the Army had basically taken a lot of the German paperclip scientists, Werner von Braun and so forth. And so they were testing these V-2 rockets that had been captured from Nazi Germany. They were now testing them in the United States because they were wanting to develop their own rocket program. Well, what happened was that these rocket tests were being disrupted by the German flying saucers that were now flying over the United States. So a message was being sent here, that the German Antarctic craft was sending the message that, hey, not only can we defeat your Navy in sending its squadrons down there to Antarctica, not only can we fly with impunity over your territory, but we can shoot down your plans for developing ICBM rockets. We can shoot down these rockets anytime we want. And that's what they were doing. They were shooting them down. They were disrupting the tests. And this was something that was well known and again covered up. One of the cover-ups that in 1947, German flying saucers out of Antarctica, or flying wings out of Antarctica, were shooting down the V-2 rockets. And that wasn't the only thing they were shooting down. Here you have a quote by Timothy Good in Need to Know, and it says, quote, "From research conducted to date," if you read that while I'm having a drink. So there, Timothy Good is saying that all of these different types of Army, Air Force and US Air Force and Navy aircraft, B-21s, B-17s, P-80s, P-51s and so forth, just in a 2-month period from May 1950 up until April 1951, that 120 airmen were killed and 74 others injured in all of these incidents, that there were over 60 craft that were shot down just in a 2-month period, all covered up. All of these US military aircraft had been shot down by these German Navy, by these German spacecraft operating out of Antarctica. Basically, there was an undeclared war happening here. Basically, the Germans were taking on the US Air Force, the US Army Air Force, and the Navy, and shooting down the best that could be thrown in them. They were basically showing that, look, if you attack our flying saucers, we're going to shoot you down. And that's what they were doing. Then in 1952, you have this major incident. This was a critical incident because this was when basically the Germans out of Antarctica showed that their spacecraft had become so advanced that they could now overfly the US capital, and they didn't have to worry about being shot down at all. That there was nothing that the US had in its arsenal that threatened the German spacecraft that were operating out of Antarctica, that were now flying over the Washington DC area. So this was really a critical event because it now meant that, okay, you know, our technology is far superior to yours. We can overfly your cities. We can shoot down any of your craft that try and shoot us down. We don't want to have a war with you. What we want to do is negotiate with you. We want to reach some agreement with you. And there were plenty of people within the US military that said this is a good idea. They have technologies that are way beyond anything that we have. We need to make deals with these guys. We need to kind of like learn from them so that we could find out how to catch up as quickly as we can to where they are. So that's what happened. It began under the Truman administration, and then under the Eisenhower administration, basically you had negotiations that were conducted and agreements were reached with the Fourth Reich. And the agreements, basically, you know, the Germans needed what the US had in abundance. What the US had in abundance was a vast industrial infrastructure, lots of highly educated technicians and personnel that could build squadrons and fleets of spacecraft that the Germans needed to have built themselves. And the Germans had been able to do this because they understood the principles of torsion field physics, of anti-gravity propulsion systems, and they also understood the principles that extraterrestrials were using in their spacecraft, that the Germans understood this, that the Germans had collaborated with a group of extraterrestrials called the reptilians, and prior to that with another group that were human looking called the Nordics, that the Germans had worked with both groups in developing their spacecraft. And the US, even though the US had gotten its hands on some of these spacecraft, it didn't understand the principles behind it. So they really needed the German know-how of how to understand spacecraft so that they could be reverse engineered, and they wanted the secrecy maintained. They didn't want the public to know that the Germans had survived the war in these enclaves in South America and in Antarctica. So you know, both sides offered each other something, and agreements were reached. So here you have a comparison of the Hannibal 2 craft that I mentioned earlier, that was designed to be a tank killer or to shoot down the bombers that were flying over Nazi Germany during the Second World War, and its similarity with the craft that was witnessed by George Adamski. And so here you have like the three kind of landing pads at the bottom. You know, sure, you have cannons down there, but the principle is the same. You have three kind of like pods down there, stabilizers. You had a major kind of hemisphere-shaped pod underneath here. You had portholes. Here you had portholes. So you know, you can see that this is pretty clearly based, that this model is based on a craft similar to this. So you know, this is where I believe that essentially what was happening was that the Germans in Antarctica in the 1940s and 50s, that they were landing, they were exposing themselves to US civilians and saying, hey, you know, we got, you know, we have this advanced philosophy we want to share with you. Now, this is where it's important to understand that the German program in Antarctica, it had a couple of wings, or had different factions in there. One faction was the German secret societies that had worked closely with Hitler's SS to weaponize flying saucers, and the other faction was associated with Maria Orsic and the Vril Society, and their goal was to basically perform deep space exploration. So they were wanting to go into deep space and to establish communications with these human-looking extraterrestrials in deep space. So that's what they did, and they came back with a lot of advanced technologies and philosophies, and they shared this philosophy with human contactees and pretended to be extraterrestrials. So this was one of the explanations for the whole contactee movement. On January 7, 1956, you had an incident where a flying saucer with Nazi insignia and uniformed crew landed near Honolulu, Hawaii. This was one of those incidents which, while it was reported, it was never widely discussed in the mainstream media because people just thought it was ridiculous. I mean, come on, Nazis landing in Oahu in 1956, you know, what's the guy been smoking? Well, the guy that actually reported this was a sergeant major with the US Army, and he was working with US Army intelligence, a very credible guy, wrote a 70-page report on this. That report was never released publicly, but yeah, the Germans were landing all over the United States and in territories like Hawaii. The Fourth Reich's Dark Fleet was built in Antarctica. Now, earlier on I mentioned all of these German companies that were responsible for building the spacecraft for the Fourth Reich in Antarctica. Well, as a result of these agreements reached in 1952 and afterwards, between the Eisenhower administration, Truman administration, and the Germans, eventually the US companies began to work closely, collaborate closely with the German companies in Antarctica in building fleets of these craft. And here you have an illustration of one of these bases, deep underground bases, that was witnessed by Corey Good when he says he went down there in 2016. And so here you have different shapes. You know, here you have very large triangular shaped craft. Here you have kind of like rectangular shaped craft. This craft up here is the craft that Good says that he traveled in to see this coming. And here you see all the thermal heat coming up from the core of Antarctica that created this vast cavern system under the ice. So above here you have ice, but the cavern was created because of all of the ice being melted and then flowing away because of this kind of like extensive water system, cavern system that exists down there in Antarctica. So this is these are some of the companies that established that the US that are part of the US military-industrial complex, and many of these companies secretly began working with the Fourth Reich, and you know, or at least began subcontracting, where they would get orders to build, say, a propulsion system, some kind of advanced propulsion system using, say, torsion field physics, and because of the compartmentalization process, you know, many of these companies might not know. So, for example, Pratt and Whitney might get an order to build like 100 propulsion systems based on these anti-gravity principles, and Pratt and Whitney, because they specialize in certain aerospace propulsion technologies, they win the contract, and so they build 100 of these things, not knowing that these actually are going to be built for building these kinds of triangular or rectangular shaped craft. So this was the way in which the procurement process went, and so now you have US companies partnering with German companies to form an interplanetary corporate conglomerate. So this is very important, because this is where real power began to shift away from the US military when it came to its military industrial complex into this interplanetary corporate conglomerate, because now US companies working with German companies have the cutting edge technologies, and that they build these systems. And so this was the formation of this entity called the Interplanetary Corporate Conglomerate. And according to Corey Good and also William Tompkins, it was by the end of the 1980s that these guys really began to put out some major kind of spacecraft. Up until that time, they were just servicing the German program, which according to Corey Good was called the Dark Fleet. So that was the program that was developed in the 1940s and 50s, and as it evolved, it became more and more powerful. It became known as the Dark Fleet, according to Good, but it was the involvement of American corporations that actually led to the development of this interplanetary corporate conglomerate that would not only develop the most advanced spacecraft for the Dark Fleet, but would also do it for the development of a corporate-run space program. In April of 2016, Corey Good says that he saw Antarctic bases that belonged to the interplanetary corporate conglomerate. Now you see these circles, you see how all of these are over, the size of the circle is an indication of how big the base is. So I think according to Corey's estimates, you had like a base that could kind of host 10,000 personnel. So right there you got 10,000, 10,000, 20,000, and then you got these smaller bases here, here and here. This smaller base here, I believe this smaller base is probably one of the original German space program bases. But predominantly these bases are in the kind of like Western Hemisphere region of Antarctica, which is very significant, based on what I'll be talking about later. But just remember that now, the West Antarctic region is where most of the bases are located, and these are all underground bases. So now we're going to kind of like shift gears a little bit more and look at what the conventional scientists have discovered in Antarctica. So first you have this, you've got to drill down under 2 miles of ice, and then you find things down there. So they found Lake Vostok under 2 miles of ice. There you see Lake Vostok, and Lake Vostok was located for a long time at the magnetic South Pole. That's why the Russians got it. But the magnetic South Pole has moved, but nevertheless, that's where Lake Vostok is. It's the biggest underground lake in Antarctica. It's around 250 miles in length and I think about 150 miles in diameter, something like that, or maybe 100 miles in diameter. But this is it's about 250 miles in length. And down here you have, this is the Vostok station. That's the original Russian station, built right next to this magnetic South Pole, which has since moved. And this is a radar image that shows Lake Vostok, and they actually detected a magnetic anomaly. This was in 1991. So immediately after Lake Vostok was discovered or confirmed in 1990, so that that's when radar penetrating technology is used to map out Lake Vostok, and they say, yep, there's a big lake down there, biggest in Antarctica. A year later, further underground kind of experiments are conducted, and they find this huge magnetic anomaly about 50 miles in diameter. Well, what could that be? There were some efforts to try and explain it as a kind of natural geological formation, but people that understand these topics of kind of like concentrated metal deposits underground say that no, this was much more than just some natural phenomenon. This was probably an underground city. So, and the first people to start talking about that was Richard Hoagland and Mike Barra back in 1991. This was around the time Vladimir Terzinsky was talking about the German space program in Antarctica. They're saying there's something going on in Antarctica. There's a huge city down there. So maybe if you want to read that while I take another drink. So here you have Hoagland and Barra basically saying that the anomaly is referencing or corresponding to something like an ancient buried city, and that this is huge, that this is like a really major discovery. Of course, the major media kind of like ignored it, but it was a pretty major thing at the time. But nevertheless, even though it was being kept from the mainstream media, it was something that a lot of the alternative media was picking up on it. Hoagland and Barra, you know, they were on Coast to Coast and had their website and so forth. Raytheon, a corporation, a major aerospace company, was awarded the Antarctic support contract in 2012. Now, the Antarctic support contract is awarded for a 10-year period by the National Science Foundation, which runs the Antarctic science programs in Antarctica on behalf of the United States. And what's interesting is that all of the companies that are given this 10-year contract have been aerospace companies, major aerospace companies that are very used to conducting compartmentalized special access programs, which basically means that they know how to run a cover program and a unacknowledged special access program. So Raytheon and all of the companies that have been awarded the Antarctic support contract know how to keep secrets and use cover programs to hide the secrets. So that's very significant, because Raytheon employees are sent down to the Lake Vostok to find out what's going on with the magnetic anomaly down there. I mean, Raytheon's job is to find out what's going on. So they send people down there and they start getting sick. So Raytheon employees are evacuated. So in this quote, Hoagland and Barra talk about some of their employees getting very, very sick. So, quote, some special project has drilled through the ice into the Lake Vostok ecosystem, and the participants have suddenly found themselves exposed to something for which their bodies literally have no immunity. 12 McMurdo personnel are supposedly in need of a dangerous emergency medical evacuation well into the Antarctic winter season. All employees of Raytheon Corporation, a high-tech firm deeply involved in a variety of black programs for the US government and all around the world. So basically, they found technology down there that was probably using some advanced torsion field physics. And I think probably what happened was that they sent their operatives down there. They encountered some of this technology. They didn't know what it was all about, and their operatives got sick and they had to be evacuated. So that was happening around 2001, 2002. And how do you keep a secret? Well, the best way to keep a secret is to hide it in plain sight, and the time-honored way of doing that is that you get a disreputable source to reveal a legitimate fact. You know, once you do that, I mean, this is what the psychological operations do all the time. If you can release a legitimate fact, a genuine fact through a disreputable source, two things are going to happen. First, the public's going to learn about something. So in this case, they're going to learn about, there are these ruins that exist under Antarctica. Well, these ruins are things that date back thousands of years, right? So there's some underground civilization that was found in Antarctica. So you're going to reveal something that's true. That is, Antarctica has these ancient ruins buried under the ice. The second thing you're going to achieve is you're going to discredit the very thing that you've been released. And basically you're going to discredit it because the source is a disreputable source. So in this case, the source for this story was this phony press release released by this Beverly Hills-based organization calling itself Atlantis TV. And as it turned out, Atlantis TV was really just kind of like putting promotion, was trying to promote a new book coming out that was going to be talking about the discovery of this ancient civilization in Antarctica and how different countries send teams down there to excavate. So basically, it's like you're hiding the truth in plain sight. You're releasing a legitimate fact, but releasing it through a disreputable source. And that's happened again and again, which is why these tabloids which release the truth, often release the truth, is actually, that's it. That's how they do it. Because once a story is released, and there's a very funny scene in Men in Black where Tommy Lee Jones Tommy Lee Jones is basically saying, he's asked, well, why do you read the Inquirer, the National Enquirer? That's crap. And Tommy Lee Jones says, no, this is how you find out what's going on. We put everything in here. And that is absolutely correct. That is how it's done. You put out legitimate news through a disreputable source, and at the same time as it's debunked, but the truth is out there. So those that know how to kind of like decode it know what's going on. So scientists begin excavations of the pre-Adamite civilization in 2002. So what is the truth? So Corey Good is telling us the truth, that in 2002, that scientists were being sent down there to Antarctica. We know that that's when the Raytheon employees were going down there getting sick. So they learned what was going on. They're sending teams down there. They find these ruins and they're excavating. They begin excavating. And so they're sending a lot of these kind of like mainstream scientists down there from different universities to excavate all of the ruins down there. According to Corey Good, they're sanitizing this as much as possible of the extraterrestrial elements, and they're kind of like seeding it with elements from ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, and just to kind of confuse things, just to kind of like get the scientists confused and arguing down there. It's just to create debate and drama, so no one knows what's going on. But the bottom line is that yes, they've discovered a flash frozen civilization down in Antarctica, which would be big news because it would rewrite the history books. So Corey Good says that basically, to cut a long story short, he says that approximately 50,000 years ago, these 3 extraterrestrial motherships crashed in Antarctica, and that this became the hub for a civilization that he calls it pre-Adamite, because all this happened before Adam and Eve. And that this became a worldwide colony, and this is where we get the legends of Antarctica. So Corey Good says that this was something that he was briefed about while he was part of the secret space programs. Support for this comes from another whistleblower. This is Pete Peterson, and he's been on Cosmic Disclosure, and he talks also about the discovery of an ancient civilization and 3 motherships buried under the Antarctic ice sheets. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that Pete Peterson is an eyewitness. He is not just saying that, this is what I read or this is what I was told. He's an eyewitness. He saw the ruins, he saw the artifacts, and he saw the spacecraft. He was one of the teams that were being taken down there in 2002 and subsequently to find out what was going on. And Corey Good says that he was taken down there in 2016. So now you've got 2 eyewitnesses who are both being part of these secret space programs, and they saw what was going on under the Antarctic ice sheet. Okay, so Corey Good, there's an article I've written where you could get to read about Corey talking about his trip down there, where he confirmed the discovery of the flash frozen alien civilization. So this he confirmed this in the trip he talks about here is in January of 2017. In April of 2016, he went down to Antarctica. He saw the bases of the interplanetary corporate conglomerate. He says he saw the bases, and he reported on that. But later on, in 2016, he's told about the discovery of this ancient civilization. He's told about the excavations that are being conducted there. So he's told about it first. He talks about that initially at the end of 2016. But in January of 2017, he is taken down there and he sees it himself. So that's where he becomes an eyewitness in early January 2017. So you can read about it in that article on exopolitics.org. Now in 2011, the Antarctic support contract shifts from Raytheon and it goes to Lockheed Martin, which begins operations in 2011. And so, that's kind of like a schematic of Lockheed Martin looking after all this. Now, the thing you have to ask yourself, now, why in the world would Lockheed Martin, which is the largest aerospace company in the United States, the largest in the world actually, building all of these advanced aerospace weapon systems, why in the world would it be interested in Antarctica? Why would it be interested in establishing a presence down there to support scientists doing research into penguins, into ice melting, into the kind of ecosystem in the under the ice there? I mean, that doesn't make sense. I mean, Lockheed Martin is there because they are your typical US aerospace company. They are looking for the most advanced technologies which can be weaponized. So they are there, and the Antarctic support contract establishes a cover for them to be there in Antarctica because they're there to basically send their people down into these underground areas and find out what is going on. That Raytheon had a lot of trouble doing it. They needed help, so they turned it over to Lockheed Martin. So that's what happens in 2011. Lockheed Martin begins operations. Then something really unexpected happened in 2015. Lockheed Martin was given this contract to be in Antarctica for 10 years, but in 2015, only after 4 years, the contract is handed off to Leidos. And Leidos is a spin-off of Strategic Applications International Corporation, SAIC, which is a very famous company established by US Navy personnel, which has always been staffed by National Security Agency officials who basically award all these contracts to SAIC. SAIC has been the company which has been most involved in unacknowledged special access programs, developing kind of like or reverse engineering off-world technologies, extraterrestrial technologies. SAIC has been involved in this. They've been involved in remote viewing, all of these things. So in 2013, SAIC does the classic trick to be able to kind of throw people off the scent. It creates a spin-off. So SAIC in 2013 creates a spin-off where it continues to exist as SAIC, but the kind of like top secret weapons programs, the classified programs, reverse engineering, alien technologies, all of that gets siphoned off into another company, or newly created company called Leidos. And so that Leidos is given the Antarctic contract. So basically, you've got US companies down there trying to excavate under the ice all of these kind of discoveries of these artifacts that are showing up as the ice is melting. As the ice sheets melt underneath, they are drilling down into the ice sheets and basically finding all of these artifacts all over Antarctica. So it's not just the United States which is doing this. It's all of the major Antarctic nations that have a presence down there. Russia, China, India, Brazil, Australia, Canada, and so forth. They are all in a race to find these ancient artifacts buried under miles of ice, which is now melting. And because of the radar penetrating technology, they can see what lies under the ice, and it's much easier for them to get to it now. So basically, as the ice sheet melts from within, you also have all of these countries drilling from the top of Antarctica down to these artifacts, to these giant cavern systems, trying to get access to all of these artifacts that are showing up on these radar penetrating technologies. Now, Corey Good mentioned that in 2016 that there was a space battle in Antarctica. I thought that this was just an interesting piece of information in terms of what's really going on in Antarctica. Antarctica is a huge place. I mean, it's almost twice the size of the contiguous 48 US states. I mean, twice the size of Australia. So it's a vast territory. So you have many factions down there, and that the elite began evacuating down to Antarctica in 2016, expecting some kind of global catastrophe. They tried to evacuate. According to Corey Good, there was this space battle that occurred over Antarctica. If you're interested in that, you can go to my website, and that article there will kind of like give you the backstory on that. Okay, John Kerry, Obama's Secretary of State, just before the US presidential election, he went down to Antarctica. Now, why did he go down to Antarctica? Well, the official story was he went down there to look at the penguins and, watch the global melting and all of that stuff, and, kind of nonsense. That's a cover story. The real reason was that he had to go down there to talk to the people running the Fourth Reich program out of Antarctica and explain to them how the US presidential election was lost, that Trump was going to win, that they had done their best, the deep state had done their best to basically make sure that Hillary Clinton win the election, but it was that the election, rather than it going down the path that they anticipated through rigging and manipulation and so forth, that it was a clean and fair election, that Trump was elected fairly, and that was because the US military threatened an overt military coup against the Obama administration if the 2016 election was rigged in any way. So a free and fair election was conducted. Trump won, Hillary lost, and Kerry went down there to explain the bad news to the Fourth Reich. So what is Trump? Now, Trump's an enigma. Obviously, he is very polarizing, very controversial. I don't want to necessarily say I support Trump. In many of his policies, I don't support at all. But there are things that he's doing that I do support. I think when it comes to releasing technologies, when it comes to fighting the deep state, I support him. I think he's doing a lot of good for the United States in untangling the power of the deep state, which has truly corrupted the United States. The Fourth Reich has corrupted the United States, and I think he's working with a faction of the US military, the White Hats in the US military, that wants to clean up the United States. So let's keep an open mind about Trump. I know he's controversial, but just keep an open mind. So, what clues do we have that this is real, that this is what's going on? Well, during his inauguration address, he said at the very end, "We stand at the birth of a new millennium, ready to unlock the mysteries of space, to free the Earth from the miseries of disease, and to harness the energies, industries, and technologies of tomorrow." I mean, that right there, I mean, it's like this man knows something. He is aware that there are secrets that are being kept and that these things, if they're released, they can revolutionize the planet. And that's exactly what I think has happened, that he's been told about some of these technologies, that he's been told about some of the things that are buried under the Antarctic ice sheets, and that if this material was released to the American public or to the world, that it would start an economic boom. And I think this is exactly what Trump wants to do. He wants to release these advanced technologies to start an economic boom. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. I'm optimistic. I hope it happens. Many people think that the Trump administration has been compromised by the deep state, but I'm still hopeful. I think the whole QAnon movement is genuine. I think that Trump, through QAnon, is releasing a lot of information about the corruption of the US political system, and hopefully through this QAnon we'll get to hear more about these suppressed technologies. So Trump sends his own emissary to Antarctica, to the Fourth Reich. Obama sent John Kerry. Trump sends Newt Gingrich to Antarctica. So there he is, with the cover story, the Penguin cover story. So Trump's emissary to the Fourth Reich, and there's Trump, and there he is with his wife Callista Gingrich. And so I believe what happened was that Newt Gingrich was sent to Antarctica to basically begin the negotiations with the Fourth Reich. And this is kind of like quintessential Trump. I mean, Trump is a deal maker. He wants to make a deal. It doesn't matter who it is. I mean, if they have real power out there, as we saw with North Korea, as we're seeing now with Iran, Trump is like, okay, let's make a deal. Let's have a face-to-face meeting and mano a mano. Let's make a deal. So that's what Trump is that's what he's all about. And that's what I think is happening with the Fourth Reich in Antarctica. And Callista Gingrich was appointed US ambassador to the Vatican in December 22nd, 2017. So look at this. February 19, 2017, Callista and Newt Gingrich go to Antarctica. They meet with the Fourth Reich. Callista Gingrich is a Catholic, and so she has good connections with the Vatican. And so they are also negotiating on behalf of the Vatican. And there it's all formalized in December of 2017. Callista Gingrich becomes the ambassador to the Vatican. So the negotiations are underway with the Fourth Reich in Antarctica. And in February of this year, 2018, we have Rex Tillerson traveling to San Carlos de Bariloche, which is the kind of like underground entryway into Antarctica. There's a lake there in Bariloche, and there's a cavern system that extends all the way from Antarctica down to, there's a cavern system that extends all the way down from Patagonia, which is in the southern region of Argentina, down to Antarctica. So Rex Tillerson travels down to San Carlos de Bariloche, which was the location that Adolf Hitler, basically retired after the Second World War. He was given a kind of honorary position for the Fourth Reich in San Carlos de Bariloche, so that way they kept all of the kind of fanatical Nazis happy, because the people running the Antarctic program out of Antarctica were the German nationalists and the Navy. But they kept the Nazis happy by appointing Hitler as this kind of honorary leader there in San Carlos de Bariloche. So Rex Tillerson goes there, and he's begins negotiations with the new leadership of the Fourth Reich. And Jeff Bezos, the Amazon founder, he goes down there, and he's down there at the same time. So Bezos, who works at the Chinese space program, so Bezos is down there with Rex Tillerson negotiating with the representatives of the Fourth Reich, all trying to make a deal. Okay, so this was research that I had done independently myself, and I put it all together, and then this came. This was Benjamin Fulford, his post in February 5th, 2018, where this is what he said. A major peace deal was reached last week in negotiations that took place literally under the light of the blue blood supermoon in a certain Asian country last week, according to sources who were present. As a result of this, the Nazi faction of the world military-industrial complex has agreed to align itself with the light side of the force. Thus, in the near future, Nazi technology, notably anti-gravity and hypersonic Mach 20 air travel, will be made available to the surface population of the planet. The sources say, Benjamin Fulford. Okay, so he didn't name that Asian country, but I think it was probably North Korea. And so this is where the negotiations were happening. North Korea, as you know, has made a remarkable turn and is now working with the Trump administration. But he talks about this agreement being reached with the German Fourth Reich program out of Antarctica. So this was like an independent confirmation of the kind of research that I had been doing myself that kind of pointed to these negotiations happening. So this of course was in February of 2018. The agreements have been reached with the Fourth Reich. Now what's happening, of course, is that the deep state is resisting this. They are fighting a last effort, a last stand to prevent these agreements from being revealed. But I think it's going to end, and eventually we're going to see a collapse of the deep state, and the Fourth Reich is going to reveal itself. But they're going to say, and it's going to be very interesting, because they're going to basically present themselves, repackage themselves, and I think it's based in truth, even though it does hide some historical kind of like relationships. They're going to say that, okay, we have always been German nationalists. We were never Nazi ideologues. And that's going to be the key distinction that these guys in Antarctica are going to put forward. And they're going to present themselves as kind of like good guys. They're going to say that, well, you know, we have this advanced technology. We wanted to share this back in the 1940s and 1950s. But, you know, the US and the Soviet Union didn't want to reveal the truth. We've been communicating with extraterrestrials since the 1940s and so forth, and we want to release all this information. So they're going to repackage themselves, and there is some historical truth in what they say. This is going to be really interesting, because there's going to be a new generation of Fourth Reich leaders coming forth, a younger generation that are going to be kind of like very savvy with all of this advanced technology and the internet, and they're going to help kind of like jumpstart the kind of like not so much the technology revolution, because we've already had a technological revolution, but the transportation industry, the health industry, all of these things are going to undergo dramatic advances in very short time. Okay, so, you know, we're seeing this, I already mentioned earlier, you know, there's soft disclosure, they're starting to hint about the truth of these, of what's really going on under the ice there. So here's an article from the New Scientist saying that there are these deep submerged rivers and lakes under the Antarctic ice sheets, and they are able to host forests and life. So they're kind of preparing people for the truth. Of course, the cavern systems under the Antarctic ice sheet, I mentioned that earlier. Scientists are confirming that yes, this is being found. This is something that is really kind of pretty critical. We've got 10 slides left, 15 minutes, so I'll kind of finish off, and then we'll have 15 minutes or so of questions. So this is the slide which is pretty critical, because it shows the University of Edinburgh study from August of 2017, and it shows the submerged volcanoes that are concentrated in West Antarctica. So it found that Antarctica, and this is something they've recently discovered only in 2017 with the new advances in radar penetrating technologies, that there are all of these buried volcanoes. They discovered 91 of them in addition to the 40 that had been previously discovered. So that means that now Antarctica, with over 130 volcanoes, has the largest concentration of volcanoes of anywhere in the world. And the volcanoes are becoming active. So the volcanoes are becoming active. So what does all this mean? What lies ahead for Antarctica and full disclosure? Well, with all of the volcanoes, one of the first things that we need to take note of is this image. This is based on temperature increase of Antarctica from 1956 to 2006. So that's a 50-year longitudinal study of temperature increase in West Antarctica that's created by NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. Now, the first question you have to ask yourself, well, you know, if this shows the temperature increase in West Antarctica, temperature increase in in Antarctica, why is it happening largely in West Antarctica? Why isn't it happening in East Antarctica? If it's global warming due to the heating of the oceans, wouldn't you expect the oceans, the coastlines of East Antarctica to be similar to what we're seeing here on West Antarctica? You would, wouldn't you? That tells us that this heating is not due to global warming from atmospheric gases caused by CO2 emissions. Something else is going on. And when you compare the maps of the temperature increase, I think it's pretty clear what's going on. These are of the 91 new volcanoes that have been discovered. That's a pretty close fit here. It shows that West Antarctica is heating up because the volcanoes underneath are becoming active. And as they become active, they're melting the ice from underneath, generating larger and larger caverns, having more and more water flow out through the underground river system down there, and accelerating the ice melt. And so you're having ice melts on the surface now of Antarctica, which are being observed. Huge holes are appearing on the surface of Antarctica, going all the way down to the core, because these volcanoes are generating vents that go all the way to the surface with all of this kind of like all of the plasma from the volcanoes. So Antarctica is melting pretty rapidly because of the volcanoes. So why are Antarctica's volcanoes activating? Well, NASA, I mean, we know that the entire solar system is moving into a region of the galaxy where you have a lot more cosmic rays coming in. This is something that many different scientists have talked about, and I suggest if you wanted to kind of look at that, just find out, just enter information into Google and just look at the noosphere or the heliosphere heating up because of cosmic rays. So there's an increase in the number of cosmic rays that are coming into our solar system, and that is heating the Earth. And as the Earth gets heated, because the sun is triggered by these cosmic rays, and the Earth is connected to the sun through an electrical kind of grid that penetrates our entire solar system, that means that the Earth is being triggered at its core, and so the hotspots all around the Earth are being triggered. So the hotspots in Antarctica, the volcanoes down there, are being triggered. The hotspots in Yosemite National Park is being triggered. So that hotspot is something to keep a look at. And of course in Hawaii, we're seeing the hotspot being triggered there. So this is something that we need to be mindful of, that the Earth's core is being triggered by these cosmic rays, and that in turn is triggering the volcanoes in Antarctica to go off. So what's going to happen if the ice sheet in West Antarctica melts? Because that's where the volcanoes are. That's where most of the ice melt is being observed. What happens if that melts? Well, there's a book by Charles Hapgood called The Path of the Pole, and it's very important because it basically describes how the locations of the geographic South Pole, I'm not talking about the magnetic, but the geographic South Pole, which is the Earth's axis of rotation, how over millennia that has moved different places that has moved to a large degree sometimes. And here's you have the foreword by Albert Einstein, where he says, quote, "In a polar region, there is continual deposition of ice, which is not symmetrically distributed about the pole. The Earth's, I'll continue. The Earth's rotation acts on those unsymmetrically deposited masses and produces centrifugal momentum that is transmitted to the rigid crust of the Earth." So what we're seeing now is that, in Antarctica, you have most ice is in East Antarctica, but there's a very large deposit of ice in West Antarctica, but it's unsymmetrically distributed. Most of the ice is in East Antarctica. There have been estimates that if West Antarctica totally melted off, the water over the oceans, all over the oceans, would rise by about 100 feet or like 30 meters. If the ice in East Antarctica melted, which is much larger, the oceans would rise by 100 meters, 300 feet. So most of the ice is concentrated in East Antarctica. So West Antarctica has much less ice, so it's unsymmetrically distributed. Now, what we're witnessing with the melt-off of West Antarctic ice sheets because of the volcanoes going off, that more of that ice in West Antarctica is going to melt off while the East Antarctic ice sheets is going to remain. So that means that the unsymmetrical distribution of the ice in Antarctica is going to grow. And that's where Einstein points out that Hapgood's theory says that the constantly increasing centrifugal momentum produced in this way will, when it has reached a certain point, produce a movement of the Earth's crust over the rest of the Earth's body, and this will displace the polar regions towards the equator. So that's what we're witnessing now with the West Antarctic ice sheet melting off. That unsymmetrical distribution of ice in Antarctica is only going to grow greater, and Hapgood's theory basically tells us that this is going to trigger a pole shift. So where was Antarctica 13,000 years ago? Antarctica 13,000 years ago, as you can see from this kind of estimate here, was kind of in the kind of more temperate regions of the southern hemisphere, and at the North Pole was over the Hudson Bay region of North America. Now, this is consistent with scientific facts. This explains why 11,000 years ago the massive North American ice sheets melted. They melted because there was a pole shift. The pole moved from being over Hudson Bay to where it currently is now in the northern latitudes, and the South Pole moved from where it was kind of like in the ocean region to the Antarctic continent. So there are many different sources saying that this has happened before, that pole shifts are a part of history. Herodotus, talking to Egyptian priests, described that 4 times in ancient history the sun rose contrary to his wont. Twice he rose where he now sets, and twice he set where he now rises. So that means there was a pole shift, that the North Pole shifted all the way to the south, or that that continents moved so much that the sun was now, that from the perspective of that the North Pole essentially moved all the way over to the South Pole, and so that's a dramatic shift or that the Earth's, which would be even a greater concern, and Hapgood talks about this, that the Earth would literally stop rotating, and then would reverse itself. So that would mean that the South Pole would remain where it was, but the Earth would actually shift rotation, and this has happened again and again, all due to the unsymmetrical distribution of weight at the poles, which is what we are seeing now. So this takes me to kind of like the final slide before we open it up for questions, which is that what's going to lead to full disclosure in Antarctica? You know, many people are very skeptical about full disclosure occurring, that the governments will never disclose. That could be true. The governments might never disclose, because what we're seeing now is that there's a lot of factions fighting each other. You know, there's one faction that's wanting to release, another faction that says, no, no, we want to keep this all secret. Well, the thing is, this might happen. And this is how Emery Smith, who's another whistleblower who's come forward and kind of like confirmed a lot of the stuff that I've talked about today. Emery Smith is a credible whistleblower, worked in the special access programs, and definitely worth looking at. Go to my website, exopolitics.org, and you'll see some recent articles I've written about him. So he says, quote, you know, it won't be the people, it won't be us exposing this, it's going to be Earth that exposes it because of the warmth. They can't fight the heat right now. And since they can't fight the heat, it's going to be really hard to explain when some of the snow melts in the next year and this giant thing starts being exposed, and different metals, said Gaia, will be disclosure. Earth will be the one who discloses it, which is beautiful, end quote. So there you have another mechanism that we haven't really thought about, which is that the Earth itself, by this mechanism of melting West Antarctica's ice sheets, if all of that gets melted off in the next few years, we're going to see things there. They can't keep it hidden anymore. So it's going to force disclosure, because many countries now have satellites up there. Even companies have satellites up there, so you can't keep it secret. So all of this I discuss in the book, Antarctica's Hidden History, which came out in March of this year. There's a Kindle edition, there's a paperback edition, and actually earlier this month, there's now, I'm happy to say, an audiobook edition. So you can now listen to it while you're doing your chores or traveling. So that's the end of the presentation. Okay, well that's it. Well, thanks. I want to thank you all for being a part of this, and I want to thank Neil for organising it. It's really been a pleasure doing this.